Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and today on the podcast, we are going to start a little celebration, a celebration of the Reformation. We're going to talk to Andrew Pettegree, who is the professor of modern history at the University of St. Andrews, where he is the founding director of the St. Andrews Reformation Studies Institute. And it's about his brand new book, Brand Luther. How the Unheralded monk turned his small town into a center of publishing, made himself the most famous man in Europe, and started the Protestant Reformation. Boom! It's a great book, a great conversation, and that's what you're going to hear. Before we do that, I got to introduce you to my friend Jason. Say hi, Jason.
Hello.
Oh, there you go. And Jason, why in the world are you joining on my podcast intro?
Because we're going on a pilgrimage together.
Oh, that's right. That's right. It's not Lord of the Rings. We're not Sam and Frodo. But Jason and I are going to be taking a pilgrimage to Germany this coming summer in August, where we're going to do 10 days following the footsteps of Luther, learning about his history and thought in Germany. And I'm pretty pumped about it.
Yeah, me too.
So, look, we're going to talk about the details after the podcast. So, if you're interested, then just wait till the end of the podcast, and then we'll tell you all about the spiritual pilgrimage going to Germany. And yes, Germany is packed full of wonderful, delicious beer. But before we do that, I just want tell me right now, what in the world is the difference between a travel trip and a spiritual pilgrimage?
Oh, I mean, a travel trip, I would say, I used to teach high school. So I took high school students, and we would just go and get on a bus and visit as many sites as we could. And the guide would talk and talk and talk, and half the students would just be constantly taking pictures and learning nothing and doing nothing but just talking to themselves. So I would say by the end of the day, and then ultimately by the end of the trip, it was we learned a few things, but we just really could have gotten a lot more out of this. So a pilgrimage, in my mind, is something that when we go on this trip together, that we build community, and that we have this rhythm of prayer, and that when we go to sites, that we connect with the history and the significance of what happened there. And it's just something that's very intentional. And you prep before you go, and you reflect at the end of the day, and you just really focus on, what can I extract from this personally, spiritually. So that's how it would be different for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's going to be different because, you and I are partnering. You work for Common Pilgrim. That's your business that you're putting together, that you're starting. And
started it.
Yeah. And I'm excited about this partnership. So here's the thing. If you're interested in finding out all the details, then you can just text Luther. That's the word you're going to text, Luther, to 44222 in the United States. If you're not in the United States, they can just go to your website, but we don't want them to do it while they're driving. So when you get off the treadmill per se, where on the interwebs can they go?
It's thecommonpilgrim.com. Everybody calls it Common Pilgrim. It's kind of like Facebook. Facebook was the Facebook. So yeah. But right now it's just the Common Pilgrim. So .com.
So go to thecommonpilgrim.com. You can text Luther to 44222. And you can also just hang out to the end of the podcast, and we'll tell you more. I guess I would say that you are going to be at Theology Beer Camp this winter in January, and that's going to be pretty awesome. So when people come to that, they'll get to meet you, and you can practice. You can practice what it would be like for 3 days in January, what it would be like to spend 10 days in Germany talking about theology, reflecting on our lives, and having delicious beer. But this January is beer camp in LA on the beach. You're all invited. You're more than welcome to come and nerd out on the beach this winter, do some theology. And the thing that's really cool is we're actually going to have like a crazy collection of podcasters at Theology Beer Camp. our friends from Crackers and Grape Juice, the Homebrewed Culture Cast, Brew Theology, even Newsworthy with Norsworthy. Luke's coming. Anyway, so and there's going to be more stuff announced. We also have already announced some of the theologians that are going to be there. The first two we talked about are Adam Clark, who is a young American black theologian, is part of the leadership of the Black Theology Group at AAR, and a friend of mine, he's coming. Clement Haskins, who's a womanist theologian, she's going to be there. My buddy Eric Hall, who's a Catholic social ethicist, is going to be there. And one of the things that's cool about the timing of the beer camp, I don't know if it's cool. All right, it's helpful or something. It's the weekend before the inauguration of our incoming president. So not only before that happening can you hang out with other progressive Christian friends on a beach when the weather's cold, but you'll be with a host of different theologians and friends who'll be talking about what it's like to think through like life, leadership, your community and such theologically as we're entering a different period of our country's history and with different challenges that the church has. So if you're interested, you can go to theologybeercamp.com, find out all sorts of goodies because, the more the merrier until there's no tickets left. All right. So here you go. Andrew Pettegree, Brand Luther, amazing book. There's also an audio version on Audible, and you're going to want to get it right after you hear this. Well, hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and today we're going to talk about Luther. But not just Luther, the theologian, Luther, the figure of history, Luther, the entrepreneur, the brand organizer. He and his collective of friends, entrepreneuring new theological ideas using technology. Oh, man, this is going to be an exciting conversation and all the way across the big pond and in St. Andrews, right? Isn't it St. Andrews?
That's correct.
It is Andrew. So thank you so much for joining us. So as we jump in talking about this book, I maybe you can let us know how you are literally like the only person in the world who could have written this text. So you have like two large academic interests, and they both collide in this book.
Well, that's kind of you. I mean, that is in a sense right. The last 30 years have been divided for me between two main concerns. One is the European Reformation, which is where I cut my academic teeth. But then about halfway through my career, I made a turn to writing on the history of communication. And a lot of that was connected with a project I have here in St. Andrews called the Universal Short Title Catalogue, which has been gathering data on all books printed before 1600, now 1700. So we have a mass of data here. And it seemed to me that data gave me the opportunity to make a really new contribution to Luther studies in the run-up to the 500th anniversary in 2017 by really combining these two strands of work, the work on religion and the work on the physical object, the book. And that's really what I've tried to do with Brand Luther.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that people, if they're thinking about the relationship of technology and religion and cultural movements and things, most of the immediate reference points are going to be kind of more contemporary type things. But when in your book, you do such a good job of inviting us into the world. You describe like the city in this, like it was like walking back into like the Shire in Lord of the Rings type of thing. You were invited into this space where all of a sudden this group of friends and technology and all these things crossing paths became this point that redirects history. For students who are engaging this type of thing for the first time, how do you describe a world where print, literacy, and this type of thing just wasn't on the horizon and then it starts emerging?
Yeah, I mean, that is difficult because you've got to try and conceive not only how print impacted on the lives of people who most wanted it, that was scholars and professors who already owned manuscript books. They simply wanted more of the same and cheaper. So their idea of what a book should be was simply the same text that had been circulating in the medieval world, but in rather higher numbers. But I wanted to ask myself, what happens if there's a new market out there that can be unlocked by people realizing the potential to talk to people not in Latin, the language of scholarship, but in their own vernacular languages? And that's where I started from. And I thought the best way to start was to imagine the effect on Wittenberg of 30 years of becoming a major printing power. So that's why I went on these 2 walks with Luther. And your listeners should know that you can actually still do this. Wittenberg has exactly the same footprint as it did in Luther's time. You can walk along the same streets, and you see many of the same buildings that were built by the time that it became a prosperous city. Wittenberg was rebuilt during Luther's lifetime on the profits of the print trade, and that's the city you can still see today.
When you're telling the story of church history prior to the Reformation, the evidence we have to work with, or text or things to get at the average person's experience of being a member of the church is really small. And oftentimes when you take this big figure type of account of history, Luther is this ginormous explosion out of nowhere. And you know, he's just this huge meteor that lights in. But one of the things I think you describe so well in the book is you're like, yes, that is the kind of impact that happened. And he was like a real person with friends. The anxieties that were driving him prior to the Protestant insights were ones he shared with others. And here's how it was stronger in him and that kind of thing. Can you introduce us to the religious or spiritual mind that Luther had, that he shared with so many other kind of lay people in his time?
Well, Luther was a very powerful theologian. He had a very fine mind, and he was really destined for a successful career in his own Augustinian order as a monk, potentially as a regional church leader, and also as a theologian. And people understood that they were in the presence of someone of great talent. But he reached his mid-30s without having written anything. And what was astonishing about Luther is that when he first decided to articulate his views in print, he found almost immediately a popular voice. And with that, he began to recast what it meant to be a theological writer. Until this point, theological debate was conducted in a rather formal structure and at very great length. You made your point by multiplying examples, by a great deal of repetition. This was also the tradition of preaching. Sermons could take 2 or 3 hours. They were endurance tests as much as anything else, both for the preacher and for his audience. Luther, out of nowhere, discovered the astonishing impact of brevity. His first major work in German, the Sermon on Indulgence and Grace, is 1,500 words long. It was a revolution in theological writing. It consists of 20 short precepts, no more than 2 or 3 sentences long. And you have to ask yourself, how did Luther do this? Where did this insight come from? I think it's hard to not deny he was an incredibly remarkable man. But I think what was crucial in Luther's case is that 3 or 4 years before 1517, he was also the town preacher in Wittenberg. And this has allowed someone who had been, until that point, a rather intense academic to connect with the ordinary men and women in the pew and get a sense of what made sense to them as well. And I think it's that experience not denying that he was a remarkable individual, a man in a million. But it was that experience, I think, which gave him the mental flexibility to make this connection.
Mm-hmm. So what part of his life and story before being the preacher there set his trajectory? There are, these infamous stories, some of which you tell, and even like the 95 Theses. You argue, even though I was told in a seminar, all that probably didn't happen. You argue for it, which is good. It helps our Reformation Day sermons. But also his relationship with his father and his family, his understanding of faith, experience in the order prior to this kind of Protestant breakthrough. What was the passions and things that drove Luther that then were fueled when he found the pulpit?
Well, I don't think he had a bad relationship with his parents. I think that was overdone because of a sort of psychohistory published in the 1950s. His relationship with his parents, I think, was probably loving but strict. And, of course, he learned a very great deal from being brought up in the household of an industrial entrepreneur. This is not really appreciated, that when Luther engaged with printing as a technical process, he brought to that the experience of a home life in the house of a man who dealt with extractive industries, who was a copper miner, who was familiar with the necessity of borrowing in order to keep a business going, and how risky it could be, because, of course, if you're a miner, the seam of precious metal can be quite near the surface at one place and then sink impossibly below the surface other. So that experience of industrial risk was very different from the curriculum vitae of any other person in the Reformation. I think that's a factor which has never really been brought into play in this. Otherwise, Luther afterwards would claim that his great Reformation revelations came as a result of a long process of doubt and wrestling with Scripture. There's an extent to which that narrative is constructed after the event. What I see in Luther is the centrality of a sense of shock and alienation that his own church were not prepared to debate with him. It's not as if his criticism of indulgences was the first time these criticisms had been made. They were very common in intellectual circles. What surprised Luther, I think, was that no one in the hierarchy was prepared to debate, but they were just keen to shut him down and shut him up. And I think it's that drove Luther into radical paths. I think the real radicalism of Luther comes in the years between 1518 and 1520, where the failure to engage with his teaching forces him into ever more esoteric and violent denunciations of his own church. You get a man who, in 1517, is a good servant of the church, asking as a professor for a debate on the subject of controversy. By 1520, he's calling the Pope the Antichrist. Now, that is an absolutely fundamental shift. It meant that many of the intellectuals who'd been quite attracted to Luther in the first instance now thought he was going too far and cut their connections with him. But there were enough who were prepared to follow him to make a reformation.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things you emphasize so well in the book is kind of core friendships.
Yeah.
Can you introduce us to some of those friends that when we're turning to this 500th anniversary of the Reformation, Luther's name wouldn't be bold and underlined without him?
Yeah. Well, I think let's talk about three. There's Philip Melanchthon. He was the intellectual of the movement. He was a very young man when he came to Wittenberg. He was in demand with 3 or 4 other universities around Europe. And Luther thought it an enormous coup to secure him. And he always fretted, particularly in these early years, that Melanchthon might be drawn away from Wittenberg by other offers, particularly by the scandal that was now growing around Luther. Melanchthon was a scholar and he was a thinker. He was not a fighter. At 2 points in the Reformation, when he's left, in essence, as a surrogate for Luther in command, first of all, when Luther was in the Wartburg, and then after Luther's death, in the crisis of the war with Charles V, Melanchthon buckled. He found these sort of confrontations impossible. He was a natural compromiser. But he and Luther worked well together. They had overlapping skills, and they formed a good partnership. Johannes Bugenhagen, we can think of him as the organizer. He was one of those who was drawn to Luther by reading his works, after which he moved down to Wittenberg to become a colleague in the university, and then succeeded Luther as the town preacher. So he was a man of practical skills, and that showed most of all in his work devising church orders for the new Lutheran churches. All the new Lutheran churches required a settlement which demonstrated how church life would be conducted in this post-Pope age. Mm-hmm. And it was Bugenhagen who wrote the details out for them. And third, I think we have to take Andreas Karlstadt. We can call him the black sheep. Because Luther's life is full of very firm friendships, but it's also punctuated with friendships that go wrong. Lothar, the printer, is one of these, but the foremost of all is Andreas Karlstadt. He had been Luther's senior colleague in the university, which I think explains some of the prickliness. He was an early critic of Luther, but then he became a firm admirer, but too fervent. It was Karlstadt who caused difficulties for the Reformation by too enthusiastic destruction of images while Luther was on the Wartburg. And after that, when Luther returned and restored control, very risky on Luther's part, because he'd been specifically told by Frederick the Wise not to do this by his own ruler, so this was an act of defiance. But he needed to come back and restore his personal control. And after that, the relationship with Karlstadt never recovered. And the Reformation is pockmarked by these bitternesses when people who've given themselves to the movement, who feel deeply committed, for some reason or another, fall off the edges. Mm-hmm. So there's tragedies in this movement, as well as stories of personal triumph.
Mm-hmm. One of the other places in the text that you describe this sense of the community behind Luther is Luther's home and relationship with students after he is married and has a family. Can you describe that? Because what I think comes out in the book is how the emergence of what we understand now as this kind of Protestant understanding of the family and faith and vocation and things is really being pioneered in those times.
Yeah, I mean, Luther's marriage is a very interesting story because it doesn't seem to have been something he wanted or actively sought. He believed in marriage because he believed in that the forced state of celibacy in which Catholic priests were held was undesirable and essentially fraudulent, because many of them were living with women and often paying to the local diocese a fee to do so, a so-called wife tax. So he wanted an honest marriage, and for that reason, many preachers, when they come over to the Reformation, the first thing they do to signal this is to take a wife. So Luther was very enthusiastic that all his followers should have a wife, but not so particularly enthusiastic to do it himself. And he only really married Katharina von Bora, who was an escaped nun, because he felt a sense of obligation to do so. And he was perfectly aware of the scandal this would cause and the glee with which his enemies would seize upon this event, a former monk marrying a former nun. But when the first furore had passed, this proved to be an extremely successful marriage, one of mutual devotion, mutual love, and mutual respect. Katharina von Bora turned out to be a formidable person. She managed the household with great elan. She ran a brew house. She had a market garden. And she took in students into their enormous house because they'd been given the whole of the Augustinian cloister for their family. So it was essentially Katharina who kept the books and kept the family afloat, because Luther was not very prudent with money. He was a bit careless. He didn't manage it very effectively. And his wife kept him on the straight and narrow. Of course, she created a household, and soon there were children also among this household. Luther turned out to be a devoted and extremely affectionate parent. But there were also these students who used to sit around his table every evening, where they would drink Katharina's beer and Luther would hold forth. And someone in the room would usually be taking notes. And it's these notes which turned into the table talk, which I think you have to understand as the sort of unbuttoned conversations you have when you've had a few beers and you're tired at the end of the evening. Some of them don't read so well today, but I think you have to understand the context.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I still think that's one of the things you have a hard time learning if your graduate work's all done online. One of the things that I'm interested in is how you understand the effect of Gutenberg technologically. Like, when human beings have these new forms of technology, new natures, shapes of communities, and understanding of the selves, and things like that emerge with it. Marshall McLuhan had that line where he said that, we shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us. Mm-hmm. So having spent so much time looking at this period of time, how would you describe the role technology played in transforming so much of what's connected to the Reformation?
I mean, one of the great pleasures of this book, and indeed the last 15 years when I've been working on book history, is that I've been studying one major technological shift from manuscript to print at a time of another great technological shift. And indeed that second technological shift, this digital age, has given us access to many of the tools to create the great big data projects that we're now engaged in. And one of the first things this taught me is that any major technological revolution is accompanied by masses of false prophecy. People really struggle to see the outcome of shifts like the shift from print to digital. I can remember, when I first started out as an academic, people said, "Oh, books are dead. You'll never get to write a book because we'll be beyond books by the time you've got one." Well, I think I'm up to 15 and counting, and there seems to be no end to books, because what consumers do, and I think this is true of the manuscript to print age as well, is people take the best of the new while retaining the old. Just like we do today, we still have rooms full of books. I can see yours, you can see mine, lined up behind us. But at the same time, we make huge use of digital resources. In other words, we don't accept a choice between the old and the new, that the new has to be giving up the old. And I think that's exactly what happened in the print age. And this meant that all the prognostication of the first boosters of print proved to be false. You couldn't make enough money from simply doing more cheaper books for existing consumers. So just like digital has had to evolve, they had to find new ways of monetizing technology, which is the real difficulty about new technology. There's always a lot of technological fascination, which will fuel it in the first 20 years or so, but actually making money from it proves to be a whole new bag of beans. Now, the way to do that in our era, in the 16th century, proved to be to write shorter books, sell them cheap, sell them locally, and get in new readers. And that's what revolutionized the print industry. In fact, it rescued the print industry. In the 30 years before the Reformation, the print industry had actually contracted. It had settled back into a small number of relatively large centers of population where you had merchants with deep enough pockets to be able to provide the investment capital necessary for big projects. Because Luther's books were so popular and so short, you could put together an edition of 700 copies of one of Luther's new tracts in about 2 or 3 days. They'd sell out immediately, so you get immediate return on your investment. The old model of print before Luther meant that you'd probably be up to 6 months to a year before you had anything to sell while the book was printed, and maybe another 18 to 24 months before you got your money back. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a long time to be investing capital, and not enough people could do it. With Latin books, also, the market is spread all over Europe, so you have huge transportation costs and costs of exchanging money, of getting payment sent back. Whereas if all your market is on your doorstep or in the same town, as proved to be the case with Luther's early works, then you don't have those same problems. So what I think happened with Luther is that the print industry finally found a way to make money, and they were able to apply this to new markets when Luther's movement had run its course. For instance, I see in my work on news media a lot of the energy and technological innovation which has gone into making Luther's pamphlets applied to a new genre of news pamphlets. Because, of course, Luther was not just leading a theological movement. He was leading a news movement as well. This was the most exciting thing going on in Germany at the time, and people treated this as a news phenomenon.
Well, one of the things that I really enjoyed about the book is how the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that he saw in his father, he brought into the print industry, be it which printers he used at what point, the desire for certain types of typesets, to the presentation of it all. A lot of people that, especially religious leaders at the time, that are used to the printed text being read by a few people out, and most people that hear it would have heard it read out loud or something. Like Luther recognizes in putting it in German and giving it to individuals that he's creating an individual relationship with so many of the readers, and that it's not just the ideas, but the style and all of it is part of the message that's being communicated.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, and that for me was one of the really unexpected parts of the story. I didn't go into writing this book realizing how much Luther had been a hands-on entrepreneur. The story of how he looks at the printing of Wittenberg's only established printer in 1517 and realizing that will not do, that you've got to have something which clothes the new teaching of the Reformation in more respectable, more lavish appearance. and then goes and does something about it. He negotiates personally with a major Leipzig printer. This leads to the establishment of a second office in Wittenberg. And then 3 or 4 extra people come. Luther understands that he can't choose a favorite, that he's got to spread his work between them all. Now, much of what you say is frustratingly lost in everyday life. I think Luther would have been in and out of the printing shops virtually every day, laying down the law, giving his instructions, saying what he wanted, and of course proofreading all the texts, which all authors had to do. So you lose this because these are spoken conversations. You only really see the extent of Luther's involvement in the printing press when he goes away for a period, as he did after the Diet of Worms, when he's kidnapped in inverted commas and taken in protective custody to the Wartburg, or then again in 1530. It's only in these events when he has to send back what would have been oral conversations as written instructions that you really see how much he's involved. And those letters were gold dust for my project.
Mm-hmm. So how would you describe the role of print and that print technology to the kind of increased notion of individualism in Protestant Christianity?
Well, the issue of individualism is a very difficult one, I think, for the Protestant Reformation. And it turned out that Luther had sort of opened up a can of worms, which I think he soon came to regret. Luther initiated this as a result of his theological revelation about justification by faith. Mm-hmm. And this led to an understanding that salvation was essentially an individual thing, and that you did not therefore need the intervention of a clerical caste in order to negotiate this salvation for you. And this was something for which he coined the phrase, the priesthood of all believers, that each man and woman were their own priest. Now, that's all very well and good, and the practical reflection of this, the good part, is that Luther strongly believed that everyone had to have an informed view of their faith. So he was a major pioneer in the field of education, mm-hmm. of catechism training, and especially of female education. Luther insisted that in order to be informed Christians, all men and women needed to have access to literacy and access to education. The difficulty that this faced him with is that if you invite people to an informed view of their faith, the risk is that they will not necessarily share with you all the core interpretations of the biblical texts. And if you deny the power of the Pope to be a court of last resort in terms of theological interpretation, then who takes the Pope's place? Mm-hmm. And this is the problem that faces the Protestant Reformation almost from the beginning, that people will not accept Luther as the voice of authority, or at least not all people will, and this leads to division and, in not many years' time, the catastrophe of the Peasants' War, which Luther then denounces. From that point on, Luther recognizes that the only salvation of the Reformation is in association with the leaders of the German princely states and cities. In other words, this will have to be an official Reformation. So here, individualism cuts both ways. On the one hand, you have a reading people, an educated people, learning themselves the essentials of the faith. On the other, they are swiftly regulated into churches where certain standards of behavior are expected and certain beliefs are held in common. So it's by no means a one-way street in terms of the development of an individual volition and intelligence.
When you're looking at the larger history of print and European culture, do you see his resistance against that move to have ultimately failed, or to have a revision? Because, like, in my head, I'm thinking, in one sense, he's a pioneer of Protestantism. He's a pioneer of a new type of economic relationships. But then he has these theological concerns that lead him to turn towards, the protection of the state, when eventually the states are swallowed by more democratic type institutions. They're connected to this individualism that he's resisting. But you tell me, because that's a relationship I'm always interested in.
Yeah, I mean, when you say eventually, it is very eventually. I mean, a democracy is a relatively recent innovation, practiced only even today in a relatively small part of the world's population. And I don't think you can necessarily see democracy as a natural or an inevitable conclusion of the Protestant Reformation. I mean, the role of print here is decidedly ambiguous. My work has mostly been with small books. I'm interested in the cheap end of the market and what gets read by ordinary people. The vision of print as a revolutionary force was first promoted by people who, in fairness, worked before the digital revolution. They worked largely with the world's great libraries. So they worked with large books, and they picked out some milestones of fine printing and saw a sort of straight line of progress between the Renaissance, the Reformation, state building, the Enlightenment, and so on. I think if you look in detail, the story is much more ambiguous. Mm-hmm. For instance, the Renaissance promotes print, but it also elevates the classics to the highest status in European intellectual life. Well, if you're a scientist, most of what you learn from the great scientific thinkers of the Greek and Roman age is not accurate. The canonization of Greek and Roman medical theory, for instance, was a disaster for medical practice in the 16th and 17th century. Galen and Hippocrates had got it completely wrong when it came to their understanding of human physiognomy. But so powerful was the impact of the Galenic model that it was impossible as an experimental scholar to gainsay it. And this puts back medicine and medical progress probably about 150 years. And that owes a lot to print, because print is not only used for the dissemination of truth and knowledge, it's also used for the dissemination of falsity and ignorance. And that goes for the fields of science as well. So I think you've got such a long run between the early 16th century in Luther and the 20th century that it's hard to argue for a direct causal connection. Obviously, in due course, a lot more people can read, and that leads to the development of a participating political public. Mm-hmm. And that's very important. But I wouldn't lay that all at Protestantism's door.
When you think of the history of the Lutheran Church and Protestantism to today, and then we're going to be turning to paying a lot of attention to it. Even Playmobil made a Luther, like a little kid's figurine. I just got one. My son doesn't know why I'm not allowed to open it. I was like, "Well,
lucky you, because I can't get one at all." So
So I'm interested in how people that may not be familiar with this conversation on the religious side, how would you introduce to a student or interested reader the Protestant or Lutheran insight to the gospel if they don't have much context for it from their religious upbringing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the key to understanding the theology of Luther is to understand that in the late medieval period, lay people invested a huge amount of their emotional energy, of their waking thoughts, and their money on their expectations for the afterlife. It was universally believed that this life on earth was a short interval before they went into the afterlife with the hope, but not the promise of salvation. And it was widely believed that before their salvation would be assured, they would spend years, centuries, possibly even millennia in a place called purgatory, which is a holding station, if you like, for people who are not irreparably damned, but are not yet for salvation. So people invested in trying to smooth their path through purgatory and the path of their deceased relatives by investing in prayer, by investing in priests to say that prayer, by investing in indulgences, by visiting and viewing relics, by going on pilgrimage. That is all propitiatory penitential acts intended to prepare their way into eventual salvation. The key insight of the Protestant Reformation and Lutheranism is to say, none of that matters. It is not these good works which decide your fate after death. It's God's free gift of salvation, freely given through the sacrifice of his Son, Jesus Christ. And of course, that is potentially an extraordinary liberating doctrine for the individual spirit. But of course, it renders much of the infrastructure of the established church redundant. You do not need monasteries because you don't need powerhouses of prayer. You don't need priests in the side altars saying endless prayers for the departed. You certainly don't need indulgences. You don't need shrines. You don't need relics. You don't need pilgrimages. Now, by this point, the church collectively is the richest institution in the Western world. It probably has about a third of the total property available at that time. An enormous wealth, although with so many priests, also huge pockets of poverty. So to cut away the theological underpinnings of such a system is theologically radical. It's also, for many people in 16th century Europe who have their beefs with the church, let's say the magistrates of a German city who resent the church's freedom from taxation, or a Protestant prince who is turning his eyes covetously on the property of the monasteries, it's also an opportunity. So you could say that Luther's theology here has a very happy convergence with the growing self-confidence of the laity in 16th century Europe. And it's that which gives it its particular contemporary power. But that's the doctrine, I think, which has enduring resonance for Protestants down the ages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's that's really helpful because when people do not have an experience of thinking that eternal conscious torment is available to them, it's hard to understand Luther. Yeah. And there's also a sense that the insight itself has power outside of that particular anxiety that hopefully, I'm looking forward to seeing how we wrestle with it as a church when the anniversary comes up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the things that I'm interested in, and you mentioned a couple things, but how would you advise, having spent some time with the emergence of this technology, for leaders in the church to be thinking about how contemporary technological shifts are changing how we communicate, how we understand ourselves, the nature of community and things? You mentioned that when these new technologies come, there are these false prophets, and you mentioned that like even the insights about Luther or even about a history had a lot to do with stuff between the text. Looking at the small writings as insightful for understanding normal people's lived experience, and that occasional texts in Luther reveal he's sitting here doing all this other stuff we had, not paid attention to. But what kind of how do you take those type of observations and then say, hey, we're going through another period of transition technologically and culturally. Here's some wisdom to walk with.
Well, my sentiment would be twofold. First of all, embrace variety, but do not become so carried away with it that you lose sight of the fact that traditional technologies haven't stopped working. I have a sort of mixed attitude to new technologies. I have embraced them partly in my research life, but I pick and choose which of them I use in other parts of my life. And I still enjoy old technologies. And I think you have to accept, particularly in a life when you're dealing with members of congregations who each have their complex relationships of their own with new technology, that many of the old technologies still work and still work for them, and you should not be contentious of that. Mm-hmm. What I see in the first age of print, among the boosters of print, is an extraordinary language of contempt for old technologies. We've left the dark ages. We're moving from darkness into light. Out of the door with these fusty old manuscripts. In fact, manuscripts were flexible in ways which print turned out not to be. When you've got a manuscript, which is a customized document, you can have exactly the text you want. You can gather them together in a collection of your own making. Print told you what you had to have. It was prescriptive in that respect. The whole text was the same in all books of the edition. And many people thought that was a step backwards. In the same way, I've been working quite a lot on the media, on news media. And when I've talked about this subject, essentially what journalists want to know is, will I have a job in 20 years' time? And my view is, if there's any sense in the world, they will. Because although the financial context for news, print media is getting ever more challenging, things which were threatened to replace it have simply crashed and burned. Citizen journalism, for instance, when you see that at work in the blog comments on the bottom of news reports, you have to think that that was not a particularly happy development. And there's many aspects of the new social media which seem to be an opportunity for the degradation of the human spirit rather than its elevation. So I would say to congregations, don't think you have to be first adopters of every technological change in order to keep up with the spirit of the future. Because actually, there's a lot of the traditional that still works. I went to an event at the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, which was a sort of closed event for news people there. And they'd just done this huge survey of the way young people get their news. And they discovered that young people, to a very large extent, get their news in much the same way that people older than them do. That is, 50% of them regarded the BBC News on television as the most reliable source of news. And all the things we've been talking about in the 2 days leading up to this, like BuzzFeed, got about 3% of the vote in this. So it's easy to extrapolate from anecdotal evidence the suggestion that, the new is driving out the old, whereas actually the old is pretty feisty. There's a very good reason why the book is such a resilient technology, because it's so serviceable. You can move about it very easily. You can use it as a reference tool. When you're scrolling online, that isn't so easy. And the book's, in my view, has got a fair few years still left in it.
Well, and one of the things you even mentioned about the manuscript is how with contemporary technology, books now get turned back into manuscripts where, I have friends that are like group writing philosophical texts together, or creating commentaries on classics where you have a digital version of it and you can read, but everyone's able to leave their commentary and references to other works in there, and how the new technology oftentimes creates a situation where you're actually retrieving an old technology in a new way.
Yeah. Well, 300 years after the invention of printing, manuscript news bulletins were regarded as by far the best, most authoritative source of news. And it always amuses me, when I come to the States, which I do quite often, that I can't get into the United States without a manuscript. That is, without filling in my customs declaration and signing it with my signature. Even though I pre-registered for a visa waiver, all sorts of electronic information has gone backwards and forward, but still this manuscript document is necessary for me to pass through Homeland Security. And it's an interesting reminder, that 400 years after the invention of printing, we still have manuscripts alive and kicking in every aspect of our life.
Well, and they bear stamps that we spent millions of dollars creating just to show that those manuscripts are authentic, which is the technology to authenticate that manuscript. Two other questions, and the first is when you got done with this project, and then you're looking forward to the anniversary of the Reformation. What about the project made you more excited about the kind of celebration and attention the 500th anniversary will get?
Well, I suppose I was always aware that lots of people would write for the 500th anniversary. And the approach to do so for me came from Penguin in New York. And I thought, well, what can I bring distinctive to the party? And I thought I wouldn't write another biography because I thought everyone would be doing that. So in a way, I was trying to see what could most benefit readers that I could do and no one else could. And that's where Brand Luther came from. And I'm actually very comfortable with the book, very comfortable with the concept of a brand. And it's that really which I'm happiest to have that in the public domain as my distinctive contribution to the whole celebration.
Mm-hmm. So the last question, I'm a competitive home brewer, and you have got all the text from back in the day. So I'm interested. Homebrewed Christianity. There's a bunch of beer and theology groups that I've spoke at during like my book release and things, and we have said, it'd be fun is finding beer recipes that are part of church history and putting the recipes up so we can brew them. So I'm interested in where you would send someone for that type of research. Where do you find that Reformation text?
Well, if you want to experience the Reformation in beer, you have to make a trip to St. Andrews, where from 2017 we will be selling our own Katharina von Bora beer with the help of one of our local micro breweries, the Eden Mill Brewery, and we've been designing this, and we'll be putting it into the public domain. So I shall save a bottle for you, and hope you'll be able to drink it. I mean, speaking seriously, it's impossible to replicate the taste of a beer from 400 years ago for two reasons, and that is the basic raw materials have been so refined over the centuries that you can't get back to the raw materials. And the other, of course, is the quality of the water. Water today is so much better than it was in the 16th century. People drank beer partly because to drink water would have been potentially life-threatening. So poor was the quality of the beer. So I don't think health and safety regulations would allow us to recreate the taste of a Reformation beer, but at least we can restore the experience, and with our wonderful Katharina von Bora beer.
Well, that sounds awesome. That sounds awesome. And when will we expect that to arrive?
Well, we're hoping to have it for our Reformation Day lecture, which we have every October. So with good fortune, it should be ready for distribution this November. But I shall tell our brewer that you're definitely interested.
Oh yeah. I've done the podcast at least 20 different breweries before, when and they're all craft breweries, and I compete. So that's exciting. I'll email you, and you send me your address, and I know we have some more. I got at least 3 of those Luther Playmobiles. So if you can't get one, I'll send you one.
That's fantastic.
Because who doesn't? If you don't have one, then I feel like Playmobil has underserved the public.
I certainly feel a bit left out.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and I hope everyone listening heads over to the website, clicks through it. You can find the book all over the places you buy books, and get ready, because there's a Reformation celebration and a beer on the horizon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Hello, everybody. This is Trip, and right there, depending on, I don't know how the video works out, is my friend Jason. Say hi, Jason.
Hey.
Yeah, and Jason is from The Common Pilgrim, and he is partnering, or The Common Pilgrim is partnering with Homebrewed Christianity for a Reformation 500 years celebratory spiritual pilgrimage in Germany. 10 days of Luther, reflection, and fermented treats across Germany.
You know what? It actually might be an extra day.
Or
if you do the air and land, because I just found out that the flight home got canceled, so we have to push it back a day. So that gives, and so Levent, who owns 2 Free Tours, who's running this whole thing, or he's organizing all the details, he's offered for those who are doing the flight to give everybody a free tour of Istanbul.
Oh, really?
So, yeah. But you have to go through Istanbul. You have to go through Turkey. So it's, a really cheap flight. You get a free, a day in Istanbul. But, you have to go through Turkey.
But what about Constantinople?
Yes. Or you could just call it Constantinople. And all of your fears will just go away. And you can sing that song,
Yes.
Just the whole time you're there.
Uh-huh.
You know that song I'm talking about. They Might Be Giants. Is that right?
Don't bring it up. It is going to get stuck in everyone's head. and then they're going to blame you. They're going to blame you. You don't want that to happen. All right. So, Jason, the Common Pilgrim, tell us about our partnership, our trip, our spiritual pilgrimage, Luther style, on this 500th anniversary of the Reformation.
Okay, so do you want me to tell the background of how we started, or just about the trip itself?
Whatever you want to say. I'll say other stuff.
Well, I got to say this because, like, I came up to you at Wild Goose. I tried to come up with a spiel of how could I, pitch this whole idea to him, and then, Tuki Tours gives out that map at AAR. You probably don't remember, you were doing something, but they give out that map every year. They put it in our little tote bag every year, and so I was like, I come up to you and I say, do you remember that map that we get at AAR? And you go, yeah, that app. I love that app. And I was like, no, not the app, the map. And you had no idea what I was talking about. And so I was like, oh, crap. Now he thinks I'm crazy. So, but after a couple emails, you actually agreed to this whole idea and you liked it. And we decided, let's go to Germany for the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, because this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Yeah.
And let's just not go just like, try to visit because like the first itinerary I sent you, it had like 1,000 things packed in it every day. And your response was like, could we like cut half of this out and just kind of chill? And I was like, yeah, that makes sense, especially if it's pilgrimage. And then I got this idea of, let's have a Sabbath day where, that day we worship in Erfurt, and then you can take excursions that day. You've got Leipzig really close. There's even Flossenburg, where Bonhoeffer was martyred, and that's a little bit of a long excursion, but you could do it on that day. So we just decided we were going to do this 10-day pilgrimage. We were going to have a kind of a relaxed atmosphere, or a relaxed kind of feel to it. But we were also going to get some really good sights in, get some education in, get some lecturing in, but then also pray. And then the best part of the night, I think the whole day will culminate in our what we're calling the Prost Lord und Luther, which is our evening festivities at local beer gardens, which I think is going to be the best part of the trip.
Oh, yeah. No, this is I'm excited. You peer pressured me into wanting to do this. I'm super excited about podcast listeners that, they're nerdy. They're also could be religious, spiritual leaders, community leaders, and are sitting here going, we're in a time of transition today, like Luther was back in the day. And I'm excited because Luther's one of my homeboys. Of the people in the church, is a theologian. You kind of get attached to different figures. You read them a lot. They're kind of always with you. He's one of my soul friends. So my goal is prior to the event, everyone that's going to be in a group together, I'm going to make a whole video class that kind of looks at the teachings, history, thought, spiritual life of Luther. So we go in kind of prepared, and then at it, we're making a journal and readings and stuff to use in the morning, and devotions and discussions and stuff at night. And my goal is really to use the experience and reflection on the history and life of Luther to help us reflect about our own history in times of transition and our own lives and vocations and that type of thing. Because, going to Germany, having beer and traveling is awesome. Doing it with people that are also coming to reflect intentionally about their life, their future, their faith, makes it more awesome. And then to do it at this time when it's literally the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, and not to try to do everything in Germany, but to follow one person and the details of their life. Because I think when you start to not kind of skim the surface like a tourist, but to dig deep into the richness of an individual's thought, life, practice, history, setting, you naturally, in a community of people doing it together, start to do the same for your own. And so when we say spiritual pilgrimage, it's not just because it seems like it would be more, I don't know, hipster marketing friendly, or I don't know what, something like that. It's like,
that's not a gimmick. Yeah. Man.
Yeah.
Oh, the whole pilgrimage idea is really.
I was just thinking one way of putting it is like, if you want to go and just like look at things, take pictures, and not reflect about yourself or your life or Luther's life and thought and stuff, you shouldn't go. Like, I mean, like, it would be awkward. Like, we're really planning on going, and in the morning, like, having time for personal reflection, engaging the history, but his thought and his life, and spending time every evening together so we can discuss and stuff. Maybe like rock down some German beverages, go to a really old church and sing Luther hymns into the early morning. Like, there's a lot of different experiences. They're really built for people who want to have a community experience and go together. So that's why I'm pretty pumped about getting to work with the Common Pilgrim and about y'all coming. So if you need more information, you can go to thecommonpilgrim.com. You can text Luther to 44222. And you can just go to homebrewedchristianity.com too. But we're real excited, and like, you should sign up because, when
I mean, you're never going to get this opportunity.
Yeah, you have to wait till like the 1000th.
Yeah, I mean, you'll be dead.
Yeah,
although I've heard that by 2029 or something like that, our consciousness will be uploaded to.
Well, we can discuss that later.
Something that we can live forever, but I don't think we'll be able to go on pilgrimage then. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. I mean, like everyone has different things that make them think of different ideas, and so some people thinking of 1,000 years after the Reformation makes them reflect on uploadable consciousness. And
I mean, that would be cool. To be honest, I don't know how that fits into the whole Christian narrative, but
I have thoughts about it, but that's probably not going to help any. If you want to talk about that, then you can talk about that with Jason in Jersey.
That's right. I'll slip that in to one of our mornings of prayer, because I am an Episcopalian, so we're going to be doing some morning prayer every day, and I can find a way to slip that in somehow. I'll write up a column where we'll pray that our consciousness will be uploaded. Because
have you ever thought about the fact, like, one of the reasons we do confessions and remissions of sin and exist in a community that tells a larger story about us that we're not really in control of versus our own, is because I don't really want to have to deal fully with everything I've ever been conscious of. Forgetfulness and memories and restoring past events is oftentimes a very helpful thing. And,
very helpful.
And if your consciousness is downloadable, then someone's going to hack it, and they're going to know what you're really thinking. And I don't really want to be held responsible for what I'm really thinking. It's hard enough to talk myself out of doing it. Now, if I have to talk myself out of ever thinking it, that's a heavy burden.
You're starting to sound like Paul in Romans.
Well, there are worse things to read, I guess. Anyway,
speaking of Romans, Luther, it was a pretty important text for him.
He liked Romans.
I think he liked Romans a lot.